look forward to telling you about our latest survey, which we just released this week, and we just completed last weekend. So let's get right to it. This is part of our ongoing survey series, which we began in 1998, and periodically we are in the field interviewing samples of Californians, random samples of Californians about a wide range of issues. This particular survey series is part of what we call the Californians and Their Government series, which during the election year focuses not just on what's on the ballot, but the context, the political, social, economic context of the election. And whenever possible, we take a look at questions that we've asked in previous years or questions that are being asked in national surveys that will give us some added context to what's going on as Californians approach the ballot issues. And this year in particular, we were focused on the presidential election, the vote on the two largest tax measures on the ballot, and governance reforms, a couple of governance reforms that are on the ballot, one fiscal and one election-related or political reform. And to understand not just these measures, but other factors around the ballot, we repeated a number of the questions that we've asked in previous polls about approval of both the executive and legislative branch at both the federal and state level, elected officials, how people are feeling about the state budget, what types of tax preferences they have, and some attitudinal questions on both the death penalty and 3 strikes, although they weren't, although we didn't ask about those specific propositions in this survey. We had, in the case of the death penalty, a question which we had from a national poll that we had asked several times to add some context and understanding around how people are feeling about the death penalty. And for 3 strikes, we had a version of a question, although different from what we've asked in the past, to try to provide some context around these two reforms, but not in any way meant to measure those particular propositions. This, one of the things that we're very proud of in terms of this survey is that we interview a large sample of Californians, not just Californians who are registered to vote, but all Californians, a sample of 2,000 adults using both cell phones and landlines to choose our random sample. And from that overall sample of adults, we then are able to look at who are the registered voters and a group that we define as the likely voters. We define that group based upon how they answer questions about their level of interest and attention to politics and the current election cycle, what kind of voting patterns they've had in the past, and their expectations for voting in November. That brought us to a sample of about just under 1,000 likely voters. Margin of errors reported there based after our weighting is taken into account. So I'm going to talk about the election results, and Jui is going to talk about the broader context from the state and national polling questions, and then make some wrap-up comments and then open it up for questions. So first of all, in terms of the presidential election, we're seeing that the Democratic ticket of Obama and Biden with 53%, and Romney and Ryan, the Republican ticket, with 39%, with relatively few undecideds or people saying that they would vote for someone else, a 14-point margin. Similar to what we've been seeing in our previous polls, what we saw before our pre-primary polls. Very strong support, obviously, for the Democratic ticket among Democrats and for the Republican ticket among Republicans. With independents in California leaning towards the Democratic ticket, which has been fairly typical for statewide races. But beyond that, I think the findings beyond that, since that doesn't come as much of a surprise given that we are a blue state, are some of the findings in terms of how people are thinking about the presidential election. And why do one might ask, and let me just point this out before we go forward, in a blue state like California, because the question we ask ourselves, why do we care about the presidential election? Since it seems to be, since we haven't seen a Republican win a presidential election in California since 1988. And the reason is because attitudes about the presidential election will ultimately drive the type of voter turnout we have in California, which ultimately will have effects down the ballot on other races, whether it's in the congressional or legislative races, state legislative races, or in the proposition. So, you have to pay close attention to what's going on in the presidential race, whether or not you feel like the outcome is predetermined. But the most interesting finding that we had in terms of satisfaction with the presidential candidate choices is that Democrats have been pretty steadily very satisfied with most Democrats reporting satisfaction. We saw a big jump in between our pre-primary poll and our post-convention poll in support that Republicans have now for choices of candidates in the election, whereas independents have been relatively flat and below 50% in both the pre-primary and the post-convention surveys. By far, and I think this is maybe the most important finding in this section, by far the issue that concerns Californians in this election is the economy and jobs. Half of them mentioning that, fewer than single digits mentioning any other issue. Most Democrats and most Republicans reporting economy and jobs. And most voters in this election saying that they're not satisfied with the amount of attention the candidates are spending on the issue most important to them. And most who name the economy saying that they're not satisfied with the amount of attention the candidates are spending on the issue of most importance to them, with Democrats more satisfied than Republicans on attention, and independents by a 2-to-1 margin saying that they're not satisfied. In terms of the congressional elections, similar to what we've seen at our other 2 points this year, most Californians saying that they prefer to have Democrats controlling the Congress as opposed to Republicans this year. That's comparable to what we saw in our earlier polls, and of course very much driven by how many Democrats and how many Republicans there are in the electorate in our state, because most Democrats want Democratic control, most Republicans want Republican control. But to some degree, again, showing the leanings of independents. Let's now turn to the propositions on the ballot. As I mentioned, we had propositions 30 to 41 to choose from, but really only an 18-minute telephone survey doesn't allow you to ask about all of those, and we choose not to do split samples. So we focus on the 2 tax measures that have the most money at stake, 30 and 38. And we ask, whenever we do ballot title, whenever we look at a proposition, we read every word of the ballot title and label that as it will appear on the ballot, whether it's grammatical or not, however it is, that's how we read it. We choose not to correct the grammar. And Proposition 30, this is the first time we've asked about Proposition 30 with the ballot title and label as it is, because that wasn't available in May. And our results today show what we would call in our business a slight majority, 52%, considering the margin of error is plus or minus 4.4% for likely voters. 4 in 10 saying that they would oppose Proposition 30, which is obviously, you all know, the governor's tax initiative. Proposition 38, when read the ballot title and label, we saw as many people supporting as opposing that measure, with 11% undecided. And so, you know, not what you would call a great difference in terms of level of support, a 7-point difference, or level of opposition, a 5-point difference. And we'll talk about what some of the similarities and differences are in terms of the levels of support in a moment. There's a big partisan divide, as there always is on tax measures in California, with Democrats very strongly supporting the governor's tax measure, Republicans very strongly opposing the tax measure, and independents pretty much mirroring what the results are for the total population, with slim majority supporting and about 4 in 10 opposed. Those are the no party preference voters. Beyond those findings, the stark partisan difference, to me, what was most noteworthy about these findings, and if you turn to our report, pages on this, you will see that. Very strong support among young voters, very strong support among women voters, very strong support among Latino voters, not such strong support among older voters, not such strong support among men, and not such strong support among white voters in California. And the findings for Prop 38, similar in terms of the overall pattern of findings, slightly different in terms of just how the numbers turn out, but Democrats showing strong support, Republicans showing strong opposition, independents more divided on this measure, with a slim majority saying that they support it. Again, the same pattern of findings, the young, women, and Latino voters all showing strong support for this measure. The one thing that caught our attention about the difference between Prop 30 and Prop 38 is, if you look at the voters who are earning over $80,000 a year, that's the group that most strongly opposes Prop 38, which would, adjust the income tax across the scale, although, definitely, more so for the upper income voters. Prop 30 doesn't have as strong a difference between income groups as Prop 38 does, but we can get back to that later. We also looked at Prop 31, Prop 31 being the measure that would call for a 2-year budget cycle and some changes to ways the budget process works, and also the state and local funding works. This measure got a lot of undecided voters in our polling. A third of all likely voters saying that they're not sure how they would vote on this measure. Only a quarter saying that they would vote yes. And across demographic groups, across political groups, as you see in this case across political groups, but across region, race, ethnic groups, lots of undecided voters. No group in which a majority said that they at this point support Prop 31, and only one group saying that they would, a majority saying that they would oppose, and you're seeing that in this slide, independent voters, 51%, again a slim majority as we would define that for independent voters. The last measure that we asked about in terms of propositions is Proposition 32, which is the measure which would place restrictions on political contributions. And we're seeing that measure with 42% in favor and 49% opposed when read the ballot title and label, with again, a partisan divide, but not as strong a partisan divide on the Republican side as there is on the Democratic side. Democrats by a 2-to-1 margin saying that they're opposed to Prop 32. Republicans by a narrower margin, and independents by a narrower margin saying that they favor it. Slim majorities in both cases. We also asked about how important the outcome of these measures, these 4 measures, are to the voter. And I thought that was very interesting, and that 60% said the outcome on Prop 30 was very important to them. 50% said the outcome on 38 was very important for them. A lot fewer saying that the 32 or 31, and less than 3 in 10 saying 31 is very important to them. In the case of both 30 and 38, not big differences between those who would vote yes and those who would vote no in terms of the level of importance that they attach to the outcome of those measures. Once again, coming back to my earlier theme about, to what degree will the presidential election impact turnout in California this year, and what will that mean for the propositions? Well, we can get back to that later when we have questions. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Jui, who was the project manager on this survey, and we look forward to your comments, but first we will hear more about the state and national context for this election. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And next we will be looking at some opinions that Californians have on important issues facing the state and the nation. This being an election year, we looked at how Californians would rate the job performance of several elected officials. At the state level, Governor Brown has an approval rating of 41% among all Californians, and the state legislature has an approval rating of 30%. Governor's approval rating has remained similar in our surveys since we started asking about his approval ratings when he took office. Among those we consider likely voters, 42% approve of Governor Brown, while 47% disapprove. And this disapproval is the highest that we have seen in our surveys. Only 22% of likely voters approve of the state legislature. Given the low approval ratings of the state legislature, how do residents view their own state legislatures representing their assembly and senate districts? We find that 36% of adults and 35% of likely voters approve of their own state legislature, but disapproval is slightly higher among likely voters. Looking at federal elected officials, with less than 2 months remaining to the general election, 60% of California adults approve of President Obama, and 27% approve of the US Congress. Once again, likely voters give slightly lower approval ratings, with half of likely voters saying they approve of the president, and the US Congress's approval ratings among likely voters stands at 17%. Senator Dianne Feinstein is up for re-election this November and has the support of half of adults as well as likely voters. In September 2006, when she was last up for re-election, her approval ratings, both among likely voters as well as adults, were similar. 51% of adults said they approved of Dianne Feinstein, and 53% of likely voters approved of her at that time. Turning to economic conditions in the state, Californians have a negative outlook, with 6 in 10 saying the state will face bad times financially in the next 12 months, and about 3 in 10 say that the state will have good times financially. We also asked Californians if they thought that the state was in a recession, and 8 in 10 believe that California is in a recession, with 4 in 10 calling the recession a serious one. While the share saying that the state is in a serious recession has declined 8 points since last September, results from surveys that we have asked this question has been similar this year. Looking at the state budget, built into the recently enacted budget is the assumption that Proposition 30 will pass. If it fails, how would Californians prefer to deal with the state's potential budget gap? Responses in the survey say that they would prefer to deal with the gap with a solution that involves a mix of spending cuts and tax increases, or a solution that has mostly spending cuts. Far fewer say that the potential deficit should be solved using tax increases or that it is okay to borrow and have a state budget deficit. In addition to the tax propositions that Mark talked about, we also asked about views on increasing several types of taxes separately. 7 in 10 oppose raising personal income taxes, which is how Proposition 38 seeks to raise funds for schools and early childhood programs. About 2 in 3 favor raising the top rate of the income tax on the state's wealthy, and a similar share oppose raising the state sales tax. Both of these taxes are included on Proposition 30 that seeks to raise funds for education and for public safety. When asked how they would feel about raising taxes on corporations, 6 in 10 favor this idea. So voters are being asked about making important decisions related to the state budget this year. And when we asked whether they preferred that the governor and legislature make all of these decisions regarding spending and taxes, or if they preferred that voters should also be involved in some of the decision making, most say that voters should be making some of these decisions at the ballot box. So we've asked this question for the third time, and each time more than 3 in 4 Californians have said that they prefer to rely on California voters to make decisions regarding the state budget this year. As Mark mentioned, we did not ask very specifically about preferences on either Proposition 34 or 36 relating to death penalty and the three strikes law, but we did ask more generally about some of the concepts behind these propositions. When asked what the penalty for first-degree murder should be, 55% say that it should be life imprisonment over parole, over 38% who say that it should be the death penalty. Opinions were similar last year as well as in February 2004, whereas in January 2000, Californians were divided. There's differences across parties, with 67% Democrats saying they prefer life imprisonment, 57% of Republicans saying they prefer the death penalty, while independents are divided. The three strikes law in California, among other things, requires a minimum of 25 years to life for third-time felony offenders. When asked if they favored or opposed revising the three strikes law in California to impose life sentences on repeat offenders, only if the third felony conviction is serious or violent, 7 in 10 or more are in favor. And those across parties as well as demographic views share this view. Now I'd like to invite Mark back to make some concluding remarks about the findings in our survey. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go away.
Oh.
We're going to have questions. Thank you. That was great. Okay, just some general comments. We see in the presidential race, not surprisingly, a margin pretty similar to what the margin is between Democrats and Republicans in our state, of 14 points for the president for his reelection. Jobs and economy, which we've seen on virtually every way we've asked the question, but now asking it in terms of what do Californians want to hear from the presidential candidates, also saying jobs and the economy being the top issue. About half of likely voters supporting the governor's tax initiative. Support slightly lower for Prop 38. We talked about some of the reasons it is. Lots of uncertainty around Prop 31, the budget and state and local government changes initiative, and a split along party lines in particular on Prop 32, with 42% supporting, 49% opposed. In concept, strong majorities favoring a change for the three strikes law. In concept, a preference for life imprisonment over death penalty compared to previous years, but again, among likely voters, only at about 50% favoring life imprisonment over the death penalty. So those are some of the atmospherics, particularly the latter 2 points around this election. We talked about some of the other atmospherics around the approval ratings of the governor, the president, the Congress, and the legislature